All right, let's dive right into this explainer. If you are looking for the absolute ultimate study guide for one of the most chaotic, truly transformative eras in U.S. history, well, you're in exactly the right place. Today, we're exploring the 1960s, the American Crucible. We're going to look at exactly how grassroots student activism and groundbreaking literature collided head-on with top-down government policy to forge the modern America we know today. So here is our roadmap for today. First, early 60s activism and literature. Then, Kennedy, Cold War and crises. 3, Johnson, the Great Society. 4, Vietnam escalation and student dissent. 5, 1968, a year of turmoil. And finally, 6, a review of goals versus policy outcomes.
Okay, Section 1, Early 60s Activism and Literature.
We have to start here, because before there were millions of people marching in the streets, there was an intellectual awakening that started to challenge the quiet, kind of forced conformity of the 1950s. If you're studying this era for an exam, pay close attention to the SDS. That's the Students for a Democratic Society, and specifically their key leader, Tom Hayden. In 1962, Hayden authored the Port Huron Statement, and their foundational demand was something called participatory democracy. Now, this wasn't just about showing up to vote every 4 years. No, it was a radical demand that citizens should have a direct, active voice in the everyday decisions that actually affect their lives. This idea, it became the absolute heartbeat of the new student activist movement. And this quote brilliantly captures just how much the era's literature fueled that early activism. This is from Michael Harrington's 1962 book, The Other America. While a lot of Americans were enjoying this post-war suburban wealth, Harrington completely exposed the invisible, deeply entrenched poverty that was hiding in inner cities and rural areas. This wasn't just some bestseller. It literally caught the attention of President Kennedy and ultimately spurred massive, top-down government policy changes that we're going to talk about in just a few minutes.
What's truly incredible about this era is how literature acted as the matchstick for distinct, massive social movements. Think about it. Jane Jacobs challenged top-down urban planning that was destroying local neighborhoods. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring practically invented the modern environmental movement by exposing the dangers of pesticides. I mean, proving a book about bugs and chemicals could literally change the world. We just talked about Harrington's spotlight on poverty, and then Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique gave this massive, undeniable voice to the quiet frustrations of middle-class suburban women, which sparked the modern women's movement. These weren't just books, they were blueprints for action.
Moving on to Section 2, Cold War and Crises. President John F. Kennedy really had to navigate extreme foreign policy tension. Just think about this sequence of events. She comes into office and almost immediately faces the massive embarrassment of the failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. Barely months later, the Soviet Union physically divides East and West with the Berlin Wall. By October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brings the entire world to the absolute brink of nuclear annihilation. And tragically, this incredibly brief, intense period ends with his assassination in Dallas in November 1963. It was a presidency completely defined by high-stakes global brinkshipment.
But let's not forget the domestic front. While Kennedy was slowly moving towards supporting civil rights legislation, entirely different cultural battles were already brewing at home. In 1962, the Supreme Court ruled in Engel v. Vitale that mandated prayer in public schools was unconstitutional. And wow, this single ruling ignited an absolute firestorm, sparking a deep cultural and religious debate that, quite frankly, continues to shape American politics today.
Section 3, The Great Society. Following Kennedy's tragic death, his vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson, stepped in and enacted sweeping domestic policies. Notice the incredible dynamic here between bottom-up activism and top-down political decisions. In 1964, LBJ declares a war on poverty, which was a direct policy response to Harrington's book. That same exact year, the free speech movement at UC Berkeley shows student activism becoming way more militant. Then, in 1965, the horrifying, nationally televised police violence against peaceful civil rights marchers in Selma directly forces the government's hand. That outrage led to the rapid passage of the monumental Voting Rights Act. So the crucial point here is understanding the phrase, the Great Society. This was LBJ's massive, super ambitious legislative vision. It was essentially the government's top-down policy response to the profound inequalities that grassroots activists, civil rights leaders, and authors had spent the early 60s dragging out into the light. The goal was nothing short of ending racial injustice and eradicating poverty. If you need to lock down the impacts of political decisions on the American public for an upcoming exam, this is your mental checklist right here. These are your essential Great Society outcomes.
The Civil Rights Act formally outlawed systemic discrimination. The Voting Rights Act fundamentally changed Southern politics by allowing federal intervention. Medicare and Medicaid created a massive health safety net for the elderly and the poor. And the Immigration Act of 1965 quietly but profoundly changed the future demographic makeup of the entire country by ending old national origin quotas. These were unbelievable domestic achievements, but all of this raises a pivotal question that entirely redefined the second half of the decade. How did such an ambitious domestic war on poverty become so completely overshadowed by a literal escalating war abroad?
That brings us to Section 4, Vietnam Escalation and Student Dissent.
You can really track a direct cause and effect here. In 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, basically handing LBJ a blank check to escalate the military presence in Vietnam. And as the draft expanded and casualties mounted, well, you can see the pushback. Militancy increased at home with the founding of the Black Panther Party in 1966. By 1967, leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. were publicly opposing the war, and massive anti-war protests, like the legendary March on the Pentagon, became the new normal.
The key takeaway here is the complete fracturing of the American consensus. The peaceful, unified goals of the early 60s just splintered. MLK boldly argued that the Vietnam War was quite literally draining the funds and the moral focus away from the war on poverty. Meanwhile, groups like the Black Panthers emerged to advocate for Black power and armed self-defense, which really reflected a growing frustration with the incredibly slow pace of nonviolent policy outcomes. And on college campuses, the large-scale draft card burnings showed that the youth felt completely betrayed by the government's foreign policy. Section 5, 1968, a year of turmoil. 1968 was a year where a relentless sequence of trauma left the nation absolutely reeling. In January, the Tet Offensive totally shattered the illusion that the U.S. was winning in Vietnam. By March, a defeated LBJ shocked everyone by dropping out of the presidential race. Then, in rapid, tragic succession, both Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert F. Kennedy were assassinated, plunging cities into riots and just deep despair. By August, the Democratic National Convention in Chicago completely devolved into televised violence between police and anti-war protesters.
And what was the political outcome of all this chaos? A massive conservative pivot. Millions of voters watched the violence in Chicago and the rioting in the streets and felt like the country was literally falling apart. Richard Nixon successfully capitalized on this fear. He won the 1968 election by appealing to what he called the silent majority, everyday Americans who weren't out there protesting, and promising a strict return to law and order. Which brings us to our final section, 6, Review, Goals versus Policy Outcomes. Let's synthesize our entire explainer here and look at the direct contrast. To truly understand this era for your studies, we need to compare the demands to the actual outcomes. The students in the STS, they wanted participatory democracy and a peaceful end to Cold War tensions. Activists wanted an end to poverty. And to be totally fair, they achieved monumental victories. The government did produce unprecedented legislation like the Voting Rights Act and Medicare. But the demand for peace was met with massive military escalation and the draft in Vietnam. And the demand for radical social change ultimately resulted in a political pivot toward conservative law and order with Nixon's election. It's a really complex, mixed legacy. Which brings us to the end. I'm going to leave you with this final provocative thought to ponder as you review your notes. Did the immense heat of the 1960s crucible actually forge the equal participatory society those young activists envisioned? Or did it ultimately forge a more resilient, conservative political system designed to contain their revolution? Who really won the battle between bottom-up activism and top-down policy? Think about that. Thanks for joining me on The Explainer today, and remember, keep questioning the history in front of you.